Hey everyone, I'm sorry it's been a couple weeks since I've posted a lecture video. I will say that I will do my best here to catch up, and we'll get ourselves back rolling here with this video that is going to address the governance structure of women's college athletics up to the point where the NCAA started sponsoring women's athletics, and then do an Olympic video for you, or a couple Olympic videos for you, and then we'll get into sport-specific female sport pioneers, athlete pioneers. So I wanted to do this governance structure video, which will be a quick video, and then I'm going to do a quick video answering the questions that you submitted about Title IX. And then hopefully that'll help clarify some things for you, because I would say the good majority of you, there was a couple of you that understood the governance structure leading up to the NCAA sponsoring women's college athletics, but the good majority of you didn't really quite understand how all of this came about and how we got to the point where the NCAA started sponsoring women's championships in collegiate athletics. So I'm going to try to do my best to help you understand. There was a lot of moving parts before the NCAA did take women's athletics under their umbrella. So there's a lot of initials and there's a lot of little committees, but I think it will give you a sense of how people were really interested in investing in women's college athletics while the NCAA was busy sponsoring men's college athletics, but not interested in hosting women's and supporting women's college athletics. And so you see and you'll understand better how the clear importance of women's college athletics started to emerge to the point where the NCAA finally did see how and why they should also support the functioning of helping women's college athletics perform at high levels like they did for men's college athletics. So early in the 1900s, let's think about, I talked about how like Smith College and Vassar and Mount Holyoke and Smith College, all those small women's colleges were starting to run programs of physical education for women, and they were hosting teams for women to participate in, as well as individual sports for women to participate in, not just for their own physical well-being and health, but they were also starting to do them for women to participate in competition. And so in the early 1900s, what we saw was an organization called the American Physical Education Association, the APEA, which then later included recreation and added the Association of Health, Physical Education, and Recreation. So it changed its name. It added dance later on in the last century, and now today it's known as Shape America. So the APEA, which is the Association of Physical Educators of America, Education of America, said that we need to start to support these women who want to have an educational experience around physical fitness. So they formed a committee, which was called the Committee on Women's Athletics, the CWA, and they strived to keep athletics in an educational environment for women, but it really clearly discouraged intercollegiate competition. So this was much more about just within in-house collegiate intramural collegiate competition for women, but again, not outside their own community of their institution. So while the CWA was helpful in promoting and pushing women to have these experiences physically and competitively, it was meant to stay very confined, very insular. What happened then in the 1920s is that you had the Women's National Amateur Athletic Federation, which is WNAF for short, so WNAAF, that then said, actually let's encourage women to play with one another at different institutions. And so they really pushed what was known as play dates. And these were essentially opportunities for women to go and have these dates where they played games, played competitions. However, they were very much thought of as like social gatherings, right? It was playing because we should play. And so they had a couple of sort of ideas around these play dates. One was there were no men invited. There were no men that should come as fans. The only fans that should be there are their friends from the institution where they're playing. If their friends from the institution where they're coming from wanted to travel with them, or have their own transportation there, they could possibly do that. But that was very rare, obviously, because that just wasn't as easy as it is today to travel from place to place. Any family members that might have been near, but not male family members. This was for women's eyes only, women's experience only. And the idea here was that they got together, they had their competition, and then afterwards they socialized, they hung out together, they had essentially what we would call today like a potluck. They had a little, snack or meal together, and they had a good time together. So essentially they were, these really were very social gatherings. They weren't met as fierce competition where we, created rivalries and we're trying to make sure we determine who's the best of the best. WNAF had a couple of things they were trying to do, which was, one, encourage this beyond our borders, our own school borders, to play and compete with others, but it had limitations. So the play date idea and atmosphere that was very social oriented versus competition oriented. They did not favor international competition. So this was not something they were sort of pursuing women to go beyond this idea of maybe the school down the road or the next, a bordering state over or things like that. They were sort of thinking very small, local, regional competitions. And they had a couple of slogans, and those slogans are very important because it really identifies the ideal of WNAF, which was you play for play's sake. So just play because you get, for the sake of playing, for the fun of it. And then they wanted every girl in a sport and a sport for every girl. So when you hear things like that, you clearly can understand that their idea was not high level, elite level, train to your best level competition. This was truly about making sport accessible to all women, all girls, playing to play because it was fun to do, and keeping it very socially oriented, fun oriented, and that was it. So there was a real clear limitation or line drawn with WNAF and what they felt was important for women in terms of competing athletically at the college level. So then in the 1930s, the National Section on Women's Athletics, the NSWA, they really started to promote what they thought ideal athletic programs should look like. And so here we sort of had an idea of trying to create equal programming across the different institutions of higher education that were hosting women's sports and women's teams, because this was starting to become a little more popular. So they promoted this idea that the most desirable athletic programs have guiding principles and standards for all involved, that everyone should follow those same guiding principles and standards. They published rules for girls and women's sports, and that they wanted all those involved and who decided to play sports would follow the same sports, and it would be sort of this idea that no matter where you went, you would be following the same rules and policies for playing volleyball here as you would be playing volleyball at another school or another place. The other thing that the NSWA wanted to do was disseminate information on sports. So rule changes or ideas for uniforms, ways to teach the sport. They wanted to stimulate and evaluate research in the field of women's athletics and see where the interest lies and see where they can gain more momentum. So NSWA did quite a bit to really foster more what we would call sort of research supported or evidence-based athletic development programs developing at colleges, and then as we trickle down lower into the youth levels. So the NSWA was doing some really great stuff. That's the National Section on Women's Athletics. And so in the 40s, they merged with WNAF, and together Women's National Association for Amateur Athletic Foundation, and then the National Section for Women's Athletics merged, and they decided, okay, well, we can create what essentially became the first governance structure. to create membership, and then promote sports and appropriate programs for women's sports. So what they did was, you could be a member by paying a membership fee. Then what you would get by being a member was sports gender appropriate programs that you could then teach at your institution, and then published sport guides, which were ways to teach the sport, ways to compete ways to compete in specific sports, etc. And so NSWA and WNAF, when they merged together, they created the first opportunity for people to sort of become a part of a culture or a network of institutions where they know what other schools were doing, and sort of had these sort of latest trends in sports and teaching sports, and performing sport competitions, and they were all doing them relatively the same way. So what happened then from there is that Shape America, which was originally the American Physical Educators of Association of Physical Educators of America organization, they created regional groups known as the National Association of Physical Education for college women. And so what those groups started to do was they supported the NSWA, and then what they did was they created kind of this holistic, balanced, integrated approach to intercollegiate sports for women. And what they wanted is that they didn't want it to focus only on elite athletes, because they felt like that's the way the men's college athletics was going, and they didn't want women to go down that same path. And so they created these ideals, this ideal structure for how intercollegiate sports could look for women, so that they didn't fall into the same pattern that men's college athletics was starting to in sort of the 40s and 50s. And so they wanted to make sure that people weren't, they were thinking about this holistic and balanced idea of coaching the female athlete. It wasn't focused solely on the elite athlete. And they wanted you to think about this sort of triangle of physical education, where at the base you had instruction, and that was the most important thing. So if you did nothing else, they wanted to make sure that you focused on good instruction for your female athletes. And that was the base of this triangle. That's where you spent most of your time. That's where we dedicated the ideals of what it meant to be a part of intercollegiate sport. Then intramural participation was in the middle, so that was sort of the next important thing. And then athletic competition was at the top, was the top part of that triangle. So you had instruction as the base, the most important, took up the most time, intramural competition, so within your own, institution, and then the athletic competition at the top, which wasn't the most important, but it was an important part of that experience. And so this was how they felt like they could keep it a holistic approach and balanced, and it wouldn't get to the point where we're only focusing on those elite athletes that would help us win those athletic competitions, when that wasn't the most important part of participation. So what we're looking at with all of these developments from these different organizations and groups is everything leading up to essentially Title IX, or pre-1970s. So what you commonly saw in college athletics for women pre-1970, between 1900 and 1970, was intramural programs, clubs, more artistic endeavors with women's sports like synchronized swimming, gymnastics, tumbling, dance. Those kinds of activities were the most popular and the most prevalent. You saw play dates most often organized. Those were the typical kinds of competitions. About 75% of colleges by 1970 were doing play dates, which was 3/4 of institutions. And so 3/4 of the women that went to 3/4 of the institutions across America were getting some kind of extramural competition, even though it was a little more of a social minded experience. Usually what you saw pre-1970 as well was that any team sponsored, any team that was at the institution was sponsored by the physical education department, not by the athletic department. So what that meant is that the participations paid their own way, they prepared their own facilities, the coach was a physical education teacher, and they had a very limited fan base because nothing was promoted through the athletic department. They weren't supported through the athletic department monetarily or fiscally. So they paid to do everything that they did at that time. And then, of course, because it was through each individual institution's physical education department and then what the students could pay out of pocket, various expectations were out there amongst all the different colleges that participated or who that had these sort of team-oriented groups. And again, remember, they were thinking like a sport for every girl and a girl for every sport. And so there was really this attitude of like, whoever wants to participate can. There's no tryouts. There is no elite level competition. We're just going to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to participate. So, if we can back up just a little bit before 1970, we did start to see this growth and this idea that women can do more than just play extramural play dates and play more, certainly more than intramural programming that we're providing for them. And so the Division of Girls and Women's Sports, the DGWS, in 1958 was, so right before 1960, was the first nationally recognized association that brought women's programs from colleges across the country together, created a structure for them to really promote athletic competition. So they were the first nationally recognized organization or association, I should say, where members paid fees and dues. It increased and improved the opportunities for women to play extramurally, more at a higher level competitively. And it really promoted that women fill the roles in sports. So the teaching roles, the coaching roles, the officiating roles, the rule writers, the rule reviewers, all of those things, they were, administratively, they were really focused on having women fill those roles. And that was the Division of Girls, Women's Sport. And what ended up happening from that group was the CIAW, the Commission of Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, formed and actually created and conducted the first national championships for women. So from the DGWS was born the CIAW, and they governed women's college sports from 1966, right? So 6 years after the DGWS was formed, the CIAW formed the Commission of Intercollegiate Athletics for Women. And they governed women's college sports and provided championship opportunities in 8 sports from 1966 to 1972. We're talking basketball, volleyball, softball, swimming, tennis, and track and field were some of the sports that they sponsored in those championships. So we started to see right before Title IX came to being, and in that pre-1970s era when most schools were doing the things I talked about just a couple minutes ago, we did start to see this emergence of national associations that wanted to create more for women. So then, of course, when Title IX passed, we saw the brilliant development of the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women. And this is the AIAW. This preceded the NCAA, but succeeded the CIAW, and it actually succeeded the CIAW in 1971. So it took over right before Title IX took effect, but everyone knew Title IX was brewing, was in the works, was going to be a great opportunity for women in education across the board. But a big area that of course an association like this one was going to focus on was the opportunity in athletics. So the AIAW originated under the Division of Girls and Women in Sport, the DGWS. It succeeded the CIAW in 1971. And it organized and supported women's intercollegiate athletics for a dozen years. And it was very successful in the aftermath of Title IX passing. They created state, regional, and national championships for women. They increased tenfold during the time that the AIAW was in charge. The AAAW was able to promote and push more scholarships for women at institutions, funding for women's athletics at institutions, and increase PR for women's athletics. And they did this because they were showing how the growth of women's sports were doing very good things for institutions, providing more opportunities across the board, not just for the students, but for the institution at large, for employment opportunities, all of these things that were sort of created from supporting women's athletics. The AIAW was able to show and support, push, and then find lots of success in helping move along. So under women's sports, under the guidance of the AIAW, did a number of things. Here are some of the things that are most important about the AIAW. They fostered broad programming that was consistent with member schools' educational aims. So they were really still about focusing on the educational experience, but still pushing to have the elite level competition opportunity that women deserved. They assisted member schools with extension and enrichment programs for developing their athletes. It stimulated the development of quality female leadership. So you saw really fantastic female coaches, fantastic female administrators starting to emerge within the AIAW. Because what happened was most institutions had a women's college athletics and a men's college athletics, because most institutions were governed in men's athletics by the NCAA and for women's athletics by the AIAW. And so because of that, institutions had a women's athletic department and a men's athletic department. It wasn't just one athletic department. So you saw lots of women leaders, as administrators doing such a wonderful job overseeing their women's departments, athletic departments, managing their budgets, managing their travel, their recruitment, their scholarships, hiring good female coaches, training them to do a great job, sending their women athletes out to compete, and yet still minding the fact that they needed to be good students, getting a good education so they could go out beyond their days at college and be successful professional career women. So you really saw things blossom and bloom under the AIAW for the dozen years that they were in control of women's athletics. They really encouraged excellence and performance. And we saw that the difference between the AIAW and the NCAA was that the AIAW really did emphasize student first, athletes second. They limited scholarships. They didn't really want to develop a broad scholarship opportunity for women. They wanted women to realize, like, this is not what you're working for when you're growing up. If you can get a scholarship, great, but there's not unlimited amounts out there, or we're not going to create this idea that there are unlimited amounts out there. So really your first aim is to get into school by your own academic merits. They advocated that all sports are treated equitably, and that they sort of wanted this idea of like a Bill of Rights for student athletes, what their rights are as students and athletes. And also to just make sure that they're focusing on doing their best as students and making sure students are looking for that right school versus the right athletic program. The AAW did not promote off-campus recruiting. They really said no off-campus recruiting. You can only recruit when an athlete comes to your campus, and that's it. No going out to events, no going to visit them at homes, no going to see them at their home school. You need to just, if they come to your school, you can recruit them that way, and that's it. And this really was to help create this idea that students should find the right educational experience or place for them, and if athletics is going to be a part of that, then they can seek that out once they find that right educational home for themselves. They also had state, regional, and national championships, where at this point the NCAA had committees that picked tournament members, and they were having just national tournaments where you had to be picked by a national tournament committee to even make the national tournament. So there was much more opportunity for women to participate in championship experiences, because they could be doing it at a state level, they could have done it at a regional level, or if they were great enough, they'd do it at a national level. So what happened then is that women's college sports just exploded. It grew. Departments were growing with women's athletics. They were adding more programs than faster than they could believe. Of course, because it's in the wake of Title IX, a lot of institutions had to do that because they needed to come up into compliance with Title IX. So what the NCAA started to see was that this was very popular. Women's sports was growing. It was a really amazing thing. And they realized that there was really, truly not only interest, but a following of women's athletics. So in 1981 at the National NCAA Convention, they voted, on the floor, they voted to start sponsoring women's championships. And essentially, because the NCAA had been around literally for decades compared to the AIAW, when they opened up the opportunity to host women's championships, they pretty much ended up absorbing the AIAW because they just couldn't, the AIAW could not compete with the foundation, the money that the NCAA already had. A lot of the institutions that had these split athletic departments said it's going to be much more beneficial for us to just have one athletic department, one administrator, not two administrators. If we can combine coaches for some sports, let's do that. Obviously have just one budget that we're managing for sports versus athletics versus, two different athletic budgets. So most institutions combine. And when they did that, of course, you're going to most likely go with the governance association that sponsors men and women, obviously, versus one that just hosts women or still be split. So most institutions all went under the NCAA umbrella. And so in 1981 is when they voted to start sponsoring women's championships. In 1982 is when the NCAA was fully on board with women's championships. And you saw the AIAW essentially disband because they couldn't stay afloat anymore. It was tough because in the wake of that and in light of that, the AIAW saw this sort of opportunity slip from their fingers to really help promote women's leaders in athletics. Since then, since the early 80s, we have seen a clear drop in women coaches, women administrators, in athletics, college athletics specifically. There are less women coaching women's teams now compared to ever before in the past, and we're reaching a number of about 40%. Whereas if you remember back when we started first talking about Title IX, the number was in the clear mid to upper 90s percentage of women that were coaching women's sports at the college level. And so that's been a dramatic shift and change since the absorption of the AIAW by the NCAA. And so, of course, also that sort of loss of control of really making sure education was the first and primary focus for these female athletes, this limitation on scholarships, even though schools are still limited with scholarship dollars, schools can kind of decide for themselves how they want to use their scholarship dollars, whereas the AIAW really encouraged institutions across the board to do the same thing with their scholarship dollars, so they knew all institutions were sort of handling their scholarship dollars the same way. There's obviously no one to really advocate for women in leadership positions, for PR work, on women's college athletics, and then, of course, no regulations over recruiting like they used to have. And there's just no state regional competitions like there was with the AIAW. And so just really your opportunity is a conference tournament if your conference hosts one in your sport. And if it's opened up to a lot of schools in your conference, versus just a few, like maybe 4 or 6, which is very common for a lot of conferences. Or the national tournament if you're so lucky to make it, which of course for most conferences is just one school per conference per sport. So it's been a big shift. A lot of the people who were leaders in the AIAW were really, really sad when the NCAA took over the AIAW. They felt maybe this was an opportunity that was slipping away from them to really push and promote female leadership in college athletics. And really, by all measures, most measures I should say, it's probably proven to be true, because there's less advocates to keep defending Title IX when it continues to be under attack by legislators and the sort of the common person who thinks the law has gone too far when really it actually hasn't, and things of that nature. And obviously when you have a lot more male leadership, they tend to hire more men. I mean, this is just statistical proof. This isn't sort of just this isn't just a like a thought on my part. This is like statistically proven that men tend to hire more men, and particularly in college athletics. And so it's difficult because women are struggling to get those chances and those opportunities that they clearly saw pathways for in the early to mid to late 70s. So that was tough. So that's how the NCAA came to be over women's college athletics. Remember, there are still other like NEIA, the NJCWA, and I'm sorry, NJCAA, the National Junior College Athletic Association, and sort of the Christian College Athletic Association. So there are other associations that oversee college sports, but the NCAA is the largest, the most well-known, and the one that hosts and has the most membership by far. And so that's the reason why we sort of focus on that. Even though it isn't the sole, sort of doesn't solely oversee women's college athletics. Hopefully that helps you a little bit to realize there was a lot that happened prior to the NCAA taking over women's college athletics. You may have to watch this one again, and probably will be helpful for you to look at the sheet that the governance sheet that I posted in Moodle that you could fill out all the different acronyms for, so you could understand what all the different acronyms stand for, what each group and organization did. And then look at that slideshow again, the governance association development, because I think it will help you understand how women's college athletics did have a birth in the early 1900s, and then how it has expanded to what we see today, being hosted and supported by the NCAA, and the struggles that we still face because we don't have a lot of strong female leadership and coaching that is helping make sure we maintain sort of those levels of excellence that the AIAW had expected us to have when women's athletics was first really blooming after Title IX was passed in 1972. So the next little short video is going to show you or answer questions that you submitted based on Title IX. And then the last two videos on this week will be Olympics. So I hope you enjoyed this little segment, and check out those answers to your Title IX questions in the next segment. Thanks, everyone.